The fog clung to the damp earth of East Anglia like a shroud, thick and suffocating. It was 3 o'clock in the morning on the 6th of March, 1944. At Station 128, the home of the 100th Bombardment Group, the silence was broken, not by the roar of engines, but by the soft splashing of bicycle tires through puddles. Young men, most of whom had not yet reached their 24th birthdays, were being shaken awake by duty officers. There was no music, no fanfare, only the smell of coal smoke and the dread of the unknown. Captain Jack Miller sat on the edge of his cot, his feet hitting the cold concrete floor. He was a pilot from Nebraska, a man who grew up with the scent of corn and open horizons, now confined to a damp Nissen hut in England. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of 20 missions pressing down on his shoulders. Each mission was a gamble where the house always held the advantage. He reached for his flight boots, his fingers trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the realization that the briefing today felt different. The rumors had been circulating for days. The big one was coming. The target that every airman whispered about in the darkness of the barracks, but feared to name aloud: Berlin. The mess hall was filled with the clatter of metal trays and the low murmur of voices. The air was thick with the scent of burnt toast and powdered eggs. Jack sat with his crew. His co-pilot, a lanky kid from California named Billy, was trying to joke, but his eyes were wide and restless. They ate in silence for the most part, knowing that for some of them, this would be the last hot meal they would ever consume. Every man in that room knew the statistics. The 8th Air Force was bleeding, and though the new P-51 Mustangs had begun to arrive, the Luftwaffe still ruled the daylight skies over the heart of the Reich. At 4 o'clock, they moved to the briefing room. The atmosphere was electric, with nervous energy. When the group commander stepped onto the podium and drew back the curtain covering the large wall map, a collective gasp rippled through the room. A thick red yarn stretched from the coast of England, across the North Sea, deep into the jagged heart of Germany, and stopped directly over the dot labeled Berlin. "Target for today," the commander announced, his voice echoing against the corrugated metal ceiling, "is the ball-bearing plant and aircraft industrial centers in the suburbs of the Reich capital. This is a maximum effort. Every flyable ship goes up. You will be part of a formation of over 700 heavy bombers." Jack felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. 700 bombers meant thousands of men. It also meant a hornet's nest of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The commander continued, explaining that for the first time, the long-range escorts, the Mustangs, would attempt to fly the entire distance. The American pilots were being told they were the best in the world, trained to a razor's edge, but they were about to fly into the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. The technical details followed: assembly altitudes at 20,000 feet, oxygen checkpoints, and the diverted routes to avoid the heaviest concentration of flak batteries. But Jack barely heard the numbers. He was thinking about his plane, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress nicknamed Heavenly Blues. He thought about the 4 Wright Cyclone engines and the 10 men who relied on him to bring them home. He looked at the map again. The distance was staggering. To reach Berlin and return meant 8 to 9 hours in a freezing, unpressurized metal tube, surrounded by high-octane fuel and tons of high explosives, all while being hunted by the most desperate and experienced fighter pilots Germany had left. As they exited the briefing, the ground crews were already at work. The sound of starters cranking and the sudden coughing roar of engines began to fill the air. The ground was slick with oil and frost. Jack walked toward his aircraft, his flight suit heavy with survival gear, a parachute strapped to his back. He looked up at the gray, overcast sky. Somewhere above those clouds, the sun was rising, but down here, it felt like the world was ending. He patted the nose of the Heavenly Blues, a silent prayer for the metal to hold together against the steel rain that was surely coming. The big one was no longer a rumor, it was a reality. And as the first of the 4 engines turned over, spitting blue smoke into the English mist, Jack Miller knew that by sunset, the air war over Europe would be changed forever. The Americans were coming for the capital, and they were coming in the light of day. The vibration of 4 Wright Cyclone engines thrummed through the aluminum skin of the Heavenly Blues, a rhythmic, violent shaking that Jack Miller felt in the very marrow of his bones. It was 5 minutes past 6 o'clock in the morning. All around the perimeter track of Thorpe Abbotts, the massive shadows of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses groaned as they taxied toward the main runway. Their tail wheels cast long, flickering shadows under the dim airfield lights, looking like prehistoric birds lumbering toward a cliff. Jack gripped the control yoke, his knuckles white inside his fleece-lined flight gloves. Beside him, Billy was calling out the pre-flight checklist over the intercommunication system, his voice cracking slightly with the adrenaline of a 20-year-old facing his mortality. Fuel selectors on main. Booster pumps on. Flaps set at 15 degrees for takeoff, Billy recited, his finger tracing the dials on the instrument panel. Jack nodded, his eyes fixed on the green signal lamp from the control tower. The light flashed, the universal command to go. Jack pushed the throttles forward. The roar transitioned from a guttural growl to a high-pitched metallic scream. 48,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, and high explosives began to roll. The runway lights blurred into long streaks of yellow. Jack felt the tail lift, the aerodynamic pressure finally overcoming the gravity that sought to keep them grounded. With a gentle back pressure on the yoke, the Heavenly Blues broke contact with the earth. As they climbed through the thick gray soup of the English overcast, the world disappeared. For 10 minutes they flew blind, relying entirely on the flickering needles of the artificial horizon and the turn and bank indicator. Then, at 8,000 feet, they burst through the top of the clouds into a world of blinding crystalline blue. The sun was a pale gold coin hanging over the North Sea. But it was the sight surrounding them that took Jack's breath away. From every corner of East Anglia, from dozens of hidden airfields like Horham, Framlingham, and Rattlesden, hundreds of silver and olive-drab bombers were rising out of the clouds. It was a vertical migration of steel. The sky was being partitioned into combat boxes. Jack saw the lead group forming up, their colorful tail markings, the square D and the triangle A, glinting in the morning light. The sheer logistics of the assembly were staggering. Over 700 heavy bombers were attempting to find their specific places in a formation that would eventually span several miles in length and height. Mid-air collisions were a constant threat in these crowded, freezing skies. Jack watched a group of B-24s, the Liberators, pass 1,000 feet below them, their twin tails wagging in the turbulent slipstream of the formations ahead. "Navigator to pilot," the voice of Lieutenant Miller, the navigator, crackled in Jack's ears. "We are crossing the coast at Lowestoft, heading 095. Next waypoint is the Dutch coast. Wind is from the northwest at 40 miles per hour. "Roger, Tex," Jack replied. "Keep a sharp eye out. The Luftwaffe knows we are coming. They have had their ears to the ground since we started our engines." As they leveled off at 20,000 feet, the temperature inside the unheated waist of the plane plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. Jack felt the familiar sting of the oxygen mask against his face, the rubber smelling of stale sweat and talcum powder. Every crew member was now a prisoner of their gear. The heavy sheepskin suits, the heated flight boots that often short-circuited and burned the skin, and the bulky chest parachutes. They were no longer individuals. They were components of a high-altitude machine. Far below, the English Channel looked like a sheet of hammered lead. Beyond it lay the occupied territories of the Netherlands, and then the border of the Third Reich itself. This was the moment of no return. In previous months, the American formations had often felt vulnerable, a slow-moving target for the German interceptors. But today, as Jack looked out his side window, he saw something that gave him a surge of fierce, vengeful pride. Hovering like guardian angels 3,000 feet above the bomber stream were the slender, elegant silhouettes of the P-51 Mustangs. Unlike the shorter-ranged P-47s, these fighters carried massive drop tanks under their wings, filled with enough fuel to take them all the way to the Big B and back. There were hundreds of them, their Merlin engines humming a different, sharper tune. For the first time in the history of the air war, the bombers were not alone. The American pilots in those fighters were the elite, the boys who had been told that the fate of the daylight bombing campaign rested on their ability to break the back of the Luftwaffe. "Look at those little friends," Billy whispered over the radio, his voice filled with awe. Jack watched the Mustangs weave back and forth, their polished spinners catching the sun. He knew that over the German border, the radar stations were already plotting their course. The German controllers would be shouting into their headsets, scrambling every available fighter from the Western Front to defend the capital. The Reich was about to wake up to a sky filled with American silver, and the heavenly blues was leading the charge into the furnace. The North Sea had vanished beneath a layer of broken clouds, replaced by the patchwork of the Dutch coastline. To Jack Miller, looking down from 24,000 feet, the world below appeared peaceful, a toy landscape of canals and dikes. But he knew better. This was the front door of the Atlantic Wall. At this altitude, the air was so thin and cold that any exposed skin would freeze in seconds. The heavenly blues groaned as it bucked in the prop wash of the 100th Bomb Group's lead ships. The formation was now a massive, tiered wedding cake of silver aluminum, stretching for miles across the horizon. "Navigator to pilot," Tex's voice crackled, sounding thin through the oxygen system. "We are crossing into German airspace in 3 minutes. Keep your eyes peeled. The Krauts usually have a reception committee waiting at the border." "Roger, Tex," Jack replied. He adjusted the trim tabs, trying to keep the heavy B-17 tucked tightly into the combat box. In this formation, their combined Browning .50 caliber machine guns created a literal wall of lead. But a single straggler was nothing more than raw meat for a Focke-Wulf. Suddenly, the sky around them was no longer empty. Small, charcoal-gray puffs of smoke began to appear, seemingly out of nowhere. 1, then 4, then a dozen. They looked soft, like cotton balls, until Jack felt the violent thump-thump of the explosions vibrating through the rudder pedals. It was flak, the German 88mm anti-aircraft fire. The German gunners on the ground were using radar to find their altitude, and they were terrifyingly accurate. "Flak at 10 o'clock, level!" yelled the top turret gunner, a kid from Ohio named Miller. A black burst erupted so close to the left wing that Jack could see the orange flash at its center. Shrapnel, jagged, red-hot shards of steel, clattered against the fuselage like handfuls of gravel thrown against a tin roof. The heavenly blues lurched to the right. Jack fought the controls, his muscles straining against the centrifugal force. "Everyone okay back there?" Jack shouted into the interphone. "Tail's fine, but they're getting personal, Cap," the tail gunner replied, his voice an octave higher than usual. High above them, the P-51 Mustangs were weaving in wide arcs. They couldn't do anything about the flak. That was a private hell for the big friends in the bombers. The fighter pilots were looking for something else. And then, Jack saw them. Far to the east, tiny silver specks were rising against the dark green of the German forests. They weren't the disorganized groups of interceptors the Americans had seen in '43. This was a massed formation, a Sturmgruppe of heavily armored FW-190 fighters, specifically designed to ram or blast the B-17 out of the sky. "Bogies! 3 o'clock high! Coming in fast!" the waist gunner screamed. Jack watched as the German fighters leveled off. They weren't diving from the sun this time. They were lining up for a head-on attack, the most terrifying maneuver in the air war. 200 miles per hour of bomber meeting 400 miles per hour of fighter. A closing speed of 600 miles per hour. The German pilots were the elite of the Udet and Richthofen wings. They had spent years defending the Reich, and they were fueled by a mixture of desperation and professional pride. They expected the American escort to turn back, as the Thunderbolts always did when their fuel ran low. They expected to find the bombers naked over the heart of Germany. But as the first wave of Focke-Wulfs tipped their wings to begin their dive, the Mustangs did something the Germans didn't expect. Instead of staying with the bombers, the P-51s dropped their silver external fuel tanks. Thousands of gallons of gasoline plummeted toward the earth, and the American fighters transformed from heavy, long-range escorts into nimble, lethal predators. They dived straight into the German formation before the interceptors could even reach the bombers. "Look at those Mustangs go!" Billy yelled, forgetting radio silence. The sky turned into a kaleidoscope of tracer fire. Jack saw a Focke-Wulf explode in a spectacular ball of orange flame as a Mustang stitched a line of fire across its engine cowling. It was a dogfight of unprecedented scale. The Germans were being intercepted 50 miles further west than they had anticipated. They were being beaten at their own game, in their own backyard. Despite the chaos, the Heavenly Blues plowed forward. The vibration of the ship changed as the nose gunner and the top turret began to fire their twin 50s. The smell of cordite filled the cockpit, sharp and acrid. Jack kept his eyes locked on the lead plane's tail, ignoring the burning wrecks that were now beginning to fall through the clouds like spent matches. They were over Germany. The Rubicon had been crossed, and the road to Berlin was paved with fire. The sky over the German province of Lower Saxony had become a chaotic tapestry of smoke and fire. High above the bomber stream, the Luftwaffe pilots of the 4th Fighter Division were experiencing a shock that would resonate through the halls of the High Command for weeks. They had been briefed that the American Little Friends, the escort fighters, would have to turn back near the border due to their limited fuel capacity. But as the German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs attempted to bank into their classic diving attacks, the P-51 Mustangs did not turn away. Instead, they stayed. Major Erich Hartmann, not the famous ace but a seasoned veteran of the Western Front, looked out from his cockpit of a Focke-Wulf 190. He saw the silver bellies of the Mustangs as they rolled inverted to meet his formation. To his horror, he realized these American planes were still carrying enough fuel to fight a prolonged dogfight at 25,000 feet. The Mustang was no longer just a long-range scout. It was a hungry wolf in the fold. "Achtung, Jabo!" Eric shouted into his radio, but the warning was too late. The American pilots were not flying the rigid, defensive formations of the previous year. They were utilizing a new tactic called ultimate pursuit. They were hunting. One P-51, painted with a distinctive yellow nose, dived from the sun at a speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It carved through the German swarm with surgical precision. Eric watched as his wingman's engine erupted in a shower of sparks and coolant. The German plane flickered, then rolled lazily toward the green fields 5 miles below, leaving a long, greasy trail of black smoke. Inside the cockpit of the Heavenly Blues, Jack Miller watched the spectacle with a mixture of awe and grim satisfaction. The sky was filled with the white, swirling ribbons of dogfight contrails. It looked like a giant had been doodling in the sky with a chalk stick. The vibration of the B-17's 50-caliber machine guns was constant now. The waist gunners, slim and red, were screaming over the interphone as they tracked a pair of Messerschmitt 109 fighters trying to sneak in from the 6 o'clock position. "They're coming in! High at 7 o'clock!" Red yelled. Jack felt the Heavenly Blues shudder as the tail gunner opened up. The smell of burnt gunpowder was so thick it began to sting Jack's eyes even through his goggles. He saw the tracers, bright, glowing streaks of light, arcing through the thin air. The German fighters were desperate. One Messerschmitt flew so close to the bomber's wing that Jack could see the pilot's leather helmet and the frantic movement of his gloved hands. But before the German could level his cannons, a Mustang climbed almost vertically from below, its 6 machine guns stitching a jagged line across the German's belly. The Messerschmitt disintegrated into a cloud of aluminum confetti. "Did you see that?" Billy shouted, his voice cracking with excitement. "That Mustang pilot just saved our skins!" "Stay focused, Billy," Jack barked, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. "We still have 300 miles to go. Keep an eye on those engine temperatures. Number 3 is running a bit hot." The German Jagdflieger, the fighter pilots, were realizing that the Americans had achieved something impossible. They had brought the air war to the very doorstep of Berlin in broad daylight, and they had brought the protection to make it stick. For the Germans, the sky was no longer a sanctuary, it was a graveyard. The sheer level of skill shown by the American pilots, who were often much younger than their German counterparts, was a bitter pill to swallow. These Americans were aggressive, well-trained, and possessed an almost reckless confidence. As the formation pushed deeper into the heart of the Reich, the Heavenly Blues passed over the smoking ruins of a German interceptor that had crashed into a small village below. The wreckage was a stark reminder of the cost of this day. For every mile they flew toward the Big B, the resistance grew more frantic, but the wall of Mustangs remained unbroken. The little friends were proving that they were the masters of the high blue yonder. Jack looked at the clock on the instrument panel. It was nearly 10 o'clock in the morning. They were halfway there. The Heavenly Blues was battered, her skin scarred by flak and machine gun fire, but she was still flying. And far ahead, hidden by the haze of distance and the smoke of 1,000 fires, lay the ultimate prize, Berlin. The German capital was about to learn that the American eagle had very long talons. By 11:30 in the morning, the Heavenly Blues had reached the outer ring of the Berlin air defenses. The temperature in the cockpit had stabilized at a brutal 50 degrees below zero. Jack Miller's breath frosted thick on the inside of his oxygen mask, and his sheepskin-lined boots felt like blocks of ice. To his left and right, the sky was no longer blue. It had turned a bruised, sickly gray from the sheer density of anti-aircraft fire. This was Flak Alley, the most concentrated belt of heavy artillery on the planet. "Pilot to crew, check in," Jack commanded, his voice strained. One by one, the men responded. Slim in the waist, red in the tail, Miller in the top turret. They were all alive, but the tension was a physical weight. They were flying into a box of steel. The German batteries, thousands of 88mm and 105mm guns, were slaved to Würzburg radar sets. They didn't need to see the bombers through the clouds. They only needed to calculate the coordinates of the massive American stream. "My God," Billy whispered, staring out the plexiglass side window. "It looks like you could walk home on those clouds of smoke." Huge, oily black bursts erupted in perfect rows of four, the signature of a German battery tracking their altitude. The Heavenly Blues tossed and turned in the turbulent air created by the explosions. A B-17 in the lead element, less than 200 yards away, suddenly took a direct hit to the number 2 engine. In a horrific instant, the wing folded upward like a broken fan, and the giant bomber spun out of formation, trailing a banner of orange flame that stretched for 100 feet. No chutes came out. 10 men vanished into the haze in 5 seconds. "Don't look at it, Billy! Eyes on the lead ship!" Jack barked, though his own heart was slamming against his ribs. The American pilots were discovering that the Germans had moved every spare gun from the Western Front to protect the capital. The flak was so thick it blocked out the sun. But even more surprising was the persistence of the Luftwaffe. Despite the mauling they had taken from the Mustangs earlier in the mission, the German commanders were throwing their last reserves into the fray. Twin-engine Messerschmitt 110 destroyers appeared on the horizon, armed with massive 21-centimeter rockets designed to break up the bomber boxes from a distance. "Rockets! 2 o'clock high!" Miller screamed from the top turret. A streak of white smoke lunged toward them, trailing a jagged wake. It missed the Heavenly Blues by 30 feet, exploding with a force that nearly flipped the heavy bomber over. Jack fought the yoke, his shoulders aching from the effort of keeping the ship level. The American formation was a wounded beast, bleeding silver fragments and smoke, but it refused to turn back. The P-51 Mustangs, low on ammunition but high on adrenaline, dived back into the fray. Jack saw a Mustang pilot, a man he would never know, pull a high-gravity turn that would have snapped the wings off a lesser aircraft. The Mustang got inside the turning circle of a rocket-carrying German plane and literally sawed it in half with .50 caliber fire. It was a display of aerial mastery that the Germans, despite their years of experience, were struggling to match. The American pilots were younger, perhaps, but they were flying with a calculated madness that was breaking the German spirit. 5 minutes to the initial point, text the navigator announced. His voice was steady, the hallmark of a man who had accepted his fate. Once we turn at the IP, it's a straight run into the target. No more evasive maneuvers. We have to hold her steady for the bombardier. Jack nodded, though Tex couldn't see him. The initial point was the most dangerous part of the mission. For the next several miles, Jack would have to relinquish control of the plane to the bombardier and the Norden bomb site. They would have to fly straight and level through the heart of the flak, unable to dodge or weave. They were about to become a stationary target for every gunner in Berlin. Heavenly Blues turned on to the final leg. Below them, through the gaps in the smoke and clouds, the sprawling gray mass of Berlin finally appeared. It was a city of millions, the brain of the Third Reich, and it was directly in their crosshairs. The first daylight raid on the capital was reaching its climax, and the price of entry was being paid in blood and silver. "I have the airplane," Lieutenant Ben Glass, the bombardier, announced over the interphone. His voice was flat, devoid of the terror that should have accompanied a man sitting in a plexiglass bubble at the very nose of a bomber flying into a wall of exploding steel. With those 4 words, Jack Miller felt the control yoke beneath his hands go slack as the autopilot, linked to the Norden bomb site, took over. For the next several minutes, the Heavenly Blues was no longer a piloted craft. It was a platform for a mathematical calculation. Ben leaned into the rubber eyepiece of the sight, his gloved fingers dancing over the knobs. He was searching for a specific set of coordinates amidst the smoke and ruins of Berlin below. The city was a jagged landscape of gray stone and black soot, crisscrossed by the silver ribbons of the Spree River. Far below, the German capital was waking up to a nightmare. The sirens had been wailing for an hour, and now the heavy flak batteries in the Tiergarten and on the massive flak towers were filling the air with a literal ceiling of shrapnel. "Correction, 2 degrees left," Ben murmured, more to himself than the crew. "Hold her steady, Jack, just a little longer." The Heavenly Blues shuddered as a burst of flak erupted directly beneath the nose. A piece of jagged steel the size of a dinner plate punched through the plexiglass, missing Ben's head by mere inches and embedding itself in the radio operator's bulkhead. The cockpit filled with the howling whistle of the wind at 200 miles per hour and the scent of ozone. "Everyone still with me?" Jack shouted, fighting the urge to grab the controls and dive away from the fire. "Still here, Cap," Ben replied, his eye never leaving the sight. "I've got the target. Industrial zone. Ball-bearing plant in sight." The American pilots and bombardiers were under immense pressure. Unlike the British, who bombed at night to overwhelm entire cities, the Americans were committed to precision daylight bombing. They had to hit specific factories to cripple the German war machine. Today, they were proving that no target in the Reich was too deep or too well defended. The German fighter pilots, seeing the bombers on their final, unwavering run, grew desperate. A pair of Focke-Wulfs ignored the Mustangs and dived straight through the American formation, their cannons blazing. "Fighters at 12 o'clock! Level!" the top turret gunner screamed. The German planes were so close that Jack could see the oil streaks on their yellow cowlings. They were trying to head on the lead ships to force them to break formation. But the American crews held. They watched the German tracers whip past their windows, the Heavenly Blues vibrating as every gun on the ship that could bear forward opened fire. One of the Focke-Wulfs took a concentrated burst from 3 different bombers and disintegrated into a spray of burning gasoline and metal. 10 seconds to release," Ben called out. The tension in the plane reached a breaking point. Every man held his breath, waiting for the lift that would signal the weight of the bombs leaving the racks. In those 10 seconds, time seemed to dilate. Jack looked out the side window and saw a B-17 in the next element take a hit to the bomb bay. It didn't burn. It simply vanished in a white-hot flash as its own ordnance detonated. There was nothing left but a smear of smoke in the cold air. "Bombs away! Bombs away!" The Heavenly Blues leaped upward as 12 500-pound high-explosive bombs tumbled into the abyss. Jack immediately grabbed the yoke, disengaging the autopilot. He banked the heavy ship into a sharp, descending turn to the left, the rally point maneuver designed to get them out of the concentrated flak zone as quickly as possible. Looking back, Ben saw the results of their work. A series of massive, rolling explosions marched across the industrial district of Berlin. High-octane fires began to bloom like lethal flowers in the heart of the city. The first major daylight blow had been struck. The Americans had reached the Big B. They had hit their mark, and now the long, bloody journey home began. "Navigator to pilot," Tex's voice came through, sounding exhausted. "Turn to 270. We have a long way to go, and the Luftwaffe is regrouping for the trip back. Keep those engines cool, Jack. We're going to need every horse we've got." The Heavenly Blues banked sharply away from the inferno that was now the Berlin Industrial District. Jack Miller felt a momentary surge of relief as the heavy bomber leveled out, but it was a fleeting sensation. The mission was only half over. They were now feet dry over the heart of enemy territory, with 500 miles of hostile airspace between their wounded wings and the safety of the English coast. The sun, hanging lower in the sky, cast long, dramatic shadows across the scarred aluminum of the bomber formation. "Pilot to waist," Jack called out, his voice raspy from the dry oxygen. "Slim, Red, how we looking back there?" "We've got holes you could throw a watermelon through, Cap," Slim replied, his voice shaking with the vibration of the ship. "Number 3 engine is spitting oil all over the left horizontal stabilizer, and the oxygen line in the tail is leaking. Red is on his portable bottle." Jack glanced at the gauges. The needle for the number 3 engine was dancing in the red zone. The oil pressure was dropping, a slow, agonizing bleed that threatened to seize the right cyclone engine at any moment. If they lost an engine now, they would drop out of the formation. In the brutal logic of the air war, a straggler was a dead man. The Luftwaffe Abbeville boys and the Udette squadrons were already regrouping, circling like sharks that had detected blood in the water. "Tex, give me a heading for the rally point," Jack commanded. "Steer 285, Jack. We need to catch up with the lead group. We're falling behind by 50 yards every minute," the navigator replied. The American pilots were exhausted. They had been flying for 6 hours in sub-zero temperatures, their nerves frayed by the constant threat of instant annihilation. But the German pilots were also reaching their breaking point. The shock of seeing American fighters over Berlin had rattled the Luftwaffe High Command. They were throwing everything into the air: night fighters, experimental prototypes, and even training units. Suddenly, the top turret gunner began to scream. "Bandits! 6 o'clock high! They're coming out of the sun!" A swarm of Messerschmitt 109 fighters dived through the formation. They weren't looking for a dogfight. They were using slash-and-run tactics, trying to pick off the damaged bombers. Jack watched as a P-51 Mustang, its silver skin glinting, rose to meet them. The American fighter pilot was a master of energy management. He pulled his nose up into a vertical climb, trading speed for altitude, and then rolled inverted to come down on the tail of a German ace. "Look at that crazy son of a gun," Billy whispered. The Mustang pilot fired a short, controlled burst. The Messerschmitt's cooling system exploded, spraying white glycol over the windshield of the German pilot. The enemy aircraft flickered and began a long, spinning descent toward the forests of Brandenburg. It was a testament to the American training program. The cadet system was producing pilots who could outthink and outmaneuver veterans who had been flying since the Spanish Civil War. However, the Heavenly Blues was hurting. A second wave of fighters focused their fire on Jack's element. 20mm cannon shells marched across the fuselage, punching through the radio room and shattering the glass in the waist window. "I'm hit! I'm hit!" Red's voice screamed over the interphone. "Medic! Slim! Get back there!" Jack yelled. The reality of the mission crashed down on them. The Big B was behind them, but the price of the raid was being tallied in the screams of young men and the smell of hydraulic fluid and blood. Jack gripped the yoke with both hands, fighting the vibration of the dying No. 3 engine. He looked out at the horizon, searching for the blue smudge of the North Sea. It felt 1,000 miles away. The Americans had proven they could reach Berlin, but now they had to prove they could survive the journey back through the gauntlet of the Reich. Chapter 4. The Gauntlet of the Return. Part 2. The Guardian's Shield. The vibration in the control yoke had transitioned from a rhythmic thrum to a violent, bone-jarring shudder. The No. 3 engine of the Heavenly Blues was dying. A thick, obsidian stream of oil trailed behind the wing, coating the horizontal stabilizer and obscuring the tail gunner's vision. Jack Miller watched the tachometer needle drop steadily. 600 revolutions per minute. 400. The engine was no longer producing thrust. It was a 3,000-pound anchor dragging them out of the safety of the combat box. "Pilot to engineer!" Jack shouted over the roar of the wind through the shattered cockpit glass. "Miller, we have to feather No. 3. It's going to tear the wing off if it seizes." "Roger, Cap. Feathering No. 3. Jack watched as the massive three-bladed propeller slowed, the blades turning edge-on to the wind to reduce drag. The Heavenly Blues lurched to the right, and Jack stomped on the left rudder pedal to compensate. They were losing airspeed. The gap between them and the rest of the 100th Bomb Group began to widen. 10 yards. 50 yards. 100 yards. In the freezing void of 20,000 feet, that 100-yard gap was a death sentence. "Straggler! We have a straggler!" A German ground controller's voice crackled over the open radio frequencies, filled with predatory glee. High above, a pair of Messerschmitt 109 Gustavs saw their opportunity. They rolled into a steep dive, their nose cannons blinking like lethal strobe lights. Jack saw the tracers arcing toward them, stitching a line across the top of the fuselage. "Top turret! Get 'em, Miller!" Jack yelled. The twin 50 calibers above Jack's head erupted, the brass shell casings clattering onto the cockpit floor. But the German pilots were experienced. They knew the B-17's blind spots. They were coming in from the 6 o'clock low position, where the belly turret struggled to track. Just as the lead Messerschmitt began to level its sights on the Heavenly Blues fuel tanks, a silver flash disintegrated the German's wing. "Blue Nose leader to Heavenly Blues." A calm, southern-accented voice broke through the static. "Sit tight, big friend. We've got your back." A P-51 Mustang, its nose painted a brilliant cerulean blue, pulled a high-gravity turn that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It didn't just drive the Germans away, it hunted them. The American pilot stayed on the tail of the second Messerschmitt, following every desperate roll and dive. Within seconds, the German aircraft was a fireball tumbling toward the patchwork fields of Hanover. "Mustangs! 2 of them!" Billy cried out, tears of relief blurring his vision. The 2 P-51s tucked in close to the Heavenly Blues, one on each wingtip. The American fighter pilots waved to Jack, their goggles reflecting the cold afternoon sun. They were low on fuel and miles from home, but they refused to leave the wounded bomber behind. This was the turning point of the air war. The Luftwaffe realized that the American escort was no longer a mere deterrent. It was a permanent shadow that could not be shaken. Inside the waist, Slim was working frantically on Red, the tail gunner. A shard of 20mm shell had caught Red in the shoulder. The blood was freezing as soon as it hit the floor, turning into dark crimson ice. "He's stable, Cap," Slim reported, his voice cracking. "But we need to get down. The oxygen is almost gone." "Hold on, Red," Jack whispered, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We're almost to the coast." The German border passed beneath them, a line on a map that had cost them so much. The North Sea appeared, a gray, churning expanse of salt and foam. To the exhausted crew of the Heavenly Blues, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. The German interceptors, low on ammunition and terrified of the lingering Mustangs, finally turned back. The Great Raid was entering its final phase. The Americans had gone to the heart of the beast, struck their blow, and were now limping back to the safety of the English mist, guarded by the little friends who had rewritten the rules of aerial combat. The North Sea was no longer a barrier. It was a bridge. As the Heavenly Blues crossed the English coastline near Great Yarmouth, the adrenaline that had sustained the crew for 8 hours began to evaporate, replaced by a crushing, leaden fatigue. Jack Miller's hands were cramped into frozen claws around the control yoke. The No. 3 engine remained feathered, a dead weight on the right wing, while the No. 4 engine began to cough, spitting blue flames and protesting the strain of carrying the crippled bomber. "Pilot to navigator," Jack croaked, his throat feeling like it had been scraped with sandpaper. "Tex, give me the long-range weather for Thorpe Abbotts. I need to know if we are landing in a soup." "Base reports 5 miles visibility, Jack. Ceilings at 2,000 feet. It is as good as it gets in England," Tex replied. His voice was thin, the sound of a man who had spent the last hour holding a compress to the radio operator's side. The Heavenly Blues was a sieve of aluminum. Through the gaps in the fuselage, Jack could see the green fields of Norfolk rising to meet them. But the landing was going to be a gamble. The hydraulic system was sluggish, and Jack wasn't sure if the landing gear would lock. He looked to his left and saw the 2 blue-nosed Mustangs still tucked in tight. The fighter pilots had stayed until the very end, ignoring their own low-fuel warnings to ensure the big friend made it to the fence. "Mustang's breaking off," Billy whispered. The 2 P-51 fighters rocked their wings in a final salute and climbed away, their Merlin engines singing a triumphant note as they headed for their own base at Bodney. They had done their job. They had taken the air war to the gates of Berlin and brought their charges home. "Gear down," Jack commanded. He held his breath as Billy threw the lever. There was a sickening silence, then a slow, mechanical groan. Thump, clack. The left main gear locked. 10 seconds later, the right followed. But the tail wheel remained retracted. "We're going to have to bring her in nose high and hope the tail doesn't snap when it hits the concrete," Jack told the crew. "Everyone not tending to the wounded, get into the radio room and brace for impact. This is going to be a rough one." The runway at Station 128 appeared through the mist, a long, welcoming strip of black macadam. The Heavenly Blues felt heavy, unresponsive, like a wounded bird trying to find its nest. Jack eased the throttles back, the remaining engines protesting the change in manifold pressure. The ground rushed up. The perimeter fence flashed by, and then, with a jarring thud that sent a shockwave through the airframe, the main tires touched the earth. The bomber skipped once, twice, and then the tail section dropped. Without the tail wheel, the rear of the fuselage slammed into the runway with a shower of sparks and the screech of tearing metal. Jack stood on the brakes, the smell of burning rubber filling the cockpit. The Heavenly Blues ground to a halt 100 yards from the end of the runway, surrounded by a cloud of dust and blue smoke. Silence. For the first time in 9 hours, the only sound was the ticking of the cooling engines. Jack let go of the yoke and leaned his head back against the armored seat. They were alive. They had flown to Berlin and back, and they had survived the Black Monday of the 8th Air Force. Part 2. The Verdict of History. As the ambulances and fire trucks raced toward the smoking wreckage of the Heavenly Blues, the true scale of the day's events began to emerge. The mission of March 6, 1944, was not just another raid. It was a tectonic shift in the history of warfare. Over the course of 12 hours, the United States Army Air Forces had lost 69 heavy bombers and 11 escort fighters, the highest single-day loss in the history of the 8th Air Force. But the price paid by the Luftwaffe was terminal. General Adolf Galland, the commander of the German fighter force, would later admit that this was the day the German air arm broke. They had lost over 60 of their most experienced pilots in a single afternoon. More importantly, they had lost the psychological battle. The sight of American fighters over their capital in broad daylight shattered the myth of the impregnable Fortress Europa. Jack Miller stood on the grass as the medics carried Red and the radio operator toward the field hospital. He looked at his plane, the Heavenly Blues, her skin scarred by hundreds of holes, her tail shredded, her engines silent. She was a wreck, but she was a symbol. The Americans had proven that they possessed the industrial might to build 1,000 such planes, and the human courage to fly them into the mouth of hell. The American pilots who flew that day were no longer the untested boys the Germans had mocked in '42. They were veterans of a new kind of war, a war of attrition and precision. The technical mastery of the P-51 Mustang, combined with the unwavering discipline of the bomber crews, had achieved the impossible. They had seized the daylight. That night, in the mess hall at Thorpe Abbott's, there was no celebration. The empty chairs at the tables told the story of the 69 crews that had not returned. But there was a new, grim determination in the eyes of those who remained. They knew that the road to victory was now open. The Big B had been reached, and though the war would continue for another 14 months, the outcome had been decided in the thin, freezing air 5 miles above Berlin. The first daylight raid on the capital was over. The era of the Luftwaffe was ending, and the era of American global air power had begun. Jack Miller walked back to his hut, the sound of the English wind the only thing left in the air, where once there had been the roar of 1,000 engines. He had done his part. They had all done their part.